No, it's somehow. Yeah, but I don't want to. How do I scroll? That's a good question. This, okay, this one is. You think I need? Oh, yeah, because of the recording, right? I mean, that's the thing. I like to show, but then I don't know. But I don't like to have this thing in my head.
Well, this didn't work very good.
No, yeah. Let's see.
Let's see.
It's interesting. It's very. I also don't know.
That's working. I think this is working. So I've now got it on standby. You just have to be aware that if it starts not behaving, you might have to switch back to this. Because Henry tried to use this yesterday, and in the end, he used a handheld. So I've turned it off to standby now. Turn it on, go to green. And then,
So I would have to carry it with me.
well, you clip it onto your pocket,
Yeah.
and then that clips onto your jacket.
Yeah. Okay. So maybe I do that. I need to go to the bathroom.
Do that first.
So I think, and I.
Yes, it would be good to if we can. Okay. Yes. Yes, it is. That's what I was going to say to you as well. Just to make
Nee, muss mit dem anderen Account sein.
Yeah.
Genau. Also, oder? Als erstes. How much time do we have until? Ah, okay.
Recording in progress.
It should work. Can you? Yeah. Okay. We have I will go upstairs.
Then it doesn't make sense to walk around.
Should work. Oh, was I just stopped the Zoom session here. I don't know why it's happening. I muted the mic, but I think it shouldn't. Then they will still be able to see it because we set up the camera in a way that that they can see the screen. I have no idea why this is happening.
Honestly, that's for sure.
Yeah.
The important I'll make sure. Yes.
Thank you very much. Sure.
Yes.
Yeah. It's a bit out. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Is there anything else upcoming that you would like to mention? Because what I'm mentioning here is this recent research is responses to the Great Recession and importance of public writing documents.
Mm,
There's anything you want to
just leave it with
What
this
is-
one. Yeah. Because the public, I mean, it's part of the story. And because that is basically, look, for many reasons, COVID has upset everything, right? Many things. And so I cannot, basically what I'm sharing is the evolving research thinking, so to speak. So,
But you know that you will not be held accountable. It's not that I'm advertising you have to absolutely cover everything that you have ever researched in your
no,
report, because that's not possible.
Yeah. They are so much better equipped than Vienna University. So, they send me into these kind of big lecture halls, and it should be, I don't know, hybrid or whatever. There's no camera. So how are you going to do that? Or so then you end up doing everything online again.
We have this at our institute. where
Yeah. Yeah.
After 2 years.
Yeah.
I still have a desktop computer with no camera, and I have to carry my private laptop to film so many things.
You can, but you can put a small camera on top of it.
I know, I just will carry this, but
Yeah.
the point is that
Yeah.
institute has not taken.
Yeah. Yeah. It's amazing.
Individually, we can.
Yeah.
Things and
Yeah.
our solutions,
Yeah.
but
And we have in the rooms, in the seminar rooms, we have a camera and you have to, if you want to show the seminar, you have to make the seminar. And if you, then you put it on you when you speak, so it's. Anyway, this is what it is.
once I introduce you, I'll just sit there and it's your time. Do you want me to do this? Do you want to interrupt you?
Yeah, I have a lot actually, so I'm not entirely sure, especially that now we start late.
It's okay, we can also end inside.
Yeah.
Once we approach 15 minutes, I can show 5 minutes.
Yeah, I mean, in 15 minutes I should be done. I don't think I have that much. I don't know because
Okay. Let's see. This microphone is working. We have no echo. Good morning, everybody, and thank you so much for showing up this morning after quite a tough day yesterday, but also fun day. So yes, our gratitude for that, and welcome, Dorothee Borle. I'm so really indeed happy and very thankful for you to show up at this conference and give us this precious time of your keynote and afterwards discussion. So as you already see, Doro will be speaking about capitalist transformations in East Central Europe since the Great Recession. What do we know? What have we missed? Dorothee is a professor of comparative politics at the Social Science Department of the University of Vienna. Previously, she held the chair in social and political change at the Department of, is this always coming through? It's okay. At the Department of Political and Social Sciences of European University Institute, EUI, in Florence. And I have to mention that prior to that, she was a professor in political science, particularly in political economy at Central European University. And that is where we met. And that is where I had this really luxury together with many other Eastern European colleagues and comrades to be sharing this political economy research group experience together with Doro and a few other very dedicated professors of political economy at CEU that I think really shaped my research outlook, and I would say also of many other young colleagues of mine. Doro is very widely published, and I won't go into mentioning all the journal names, but I would emphasize that she is perhaps the best known for the award-winning book called capitalist diversity on Europe's periphery, a very influential one that has again shaped a lot of our researches, co-authored with Bela Greškovic. Her research areas include, I would summarize them in two main directions. On the first hand, international political economy with focus on EU integration, finance, and financialization. And on the other hand, comparative political economy with a focus on varieties of capitalism, welfare states, industrial relations, housing regimes. Her recent research, and I think we will be hearing a little bit of this today, has been looking at the responses to Great Recession in East and Western Europe. Doro, I'll stop here, give you the word, and we'll look forward to the discussion part.
Okay. Thank you very much. First of all, Leila, thank you very much for these kind words and for inviting me here. It's a big pleasure and an honor to be here. And I'm a bit excited because I am a political scientist and I talk to mostly non-political scientists. And Leila and Thilo yesterday have laid out an agenda for the conference. And when I came home, I was thinking, so how is what I basically am sharing with you or plan to share with you, how is that fitting into this nice agenda that was laid out? And luckily, I think I found at least two entry points. So what I plan to, and I will tell you which they are. So what I plan to do today is to basically share some of my thoughts and also research, partly that have more or less finished, but partly that is ongoing, on the transformations of capitalism in East Central Europe since the Great Recession. So the first topic clearly that comes here into the open and that ties up to what Leila and Timo yesterday outlined is crisis and contestation, right? So the Great Recession or the Great Financial Crisis is the first crisis that basically has led to, if you want, a deviation and a big politicization of neoliberal capitalism, which has been the hallmark in East Central Europe. Yeah? Okay, is it better like this? Oh, okay, good. So then I don't have to hang over this. Okay, so that is the first entry where I think this relates to the topic of this conference. The second is that I want to look into how is actually the recent changes been thought in the literature, especially the more recent literature. And what is interesting there is a lot of knowledge, or it's a cottage industry, knowledge production in the region of younger scholars that basically come from the region. The countries I focus on, Poland and Hungary, it's mostly Hungarian scholars. So you see basically a new wave of thinking about what have we seen or what are we seeing that mostly deals with this, what they conceive as an authoritarian turn in the capitalism. So I will go into that. And then the third part, which is also linked to some of the topics here of this conference, my sense is that in thinking about the recent transformations in terms of authoritarian capitalism and so on, there are interesting blind spots. And I just identify one, and that is gender. And my sense is that also when I look at so we talk a lot about industry, deindustrialization, big infrastructures, and the state. We do not talk very much, or at least in the field where I come from, not talk very much about actually the transformations that are not related to industry and industrial capitalism. And I want to bring in a gender perspective as an outlook of where I think some of the research in this, looking at the transformations, can and should be going. So this is my structure. The first part will be how far has neoliberalism been abundant in the region. So as I said, there is quite a bit of reason for thinking that it has been abundant. There is contestation, but how far has this really gone? And when I talk about the region, I should say that I mostly talk about the EU member states, the new EU member states. So I don't venture any further than that. And I will very briefly here also talk about whether COVID-19 has been a game changer after I look into the consequences of the Great Recession. And basically here, my argument will be we see a lot of resilience of neoliberalism, more than was to be expected, with some exceptions, and these are the new forms of capitalism that are emerging in Hungary and Poland, most specifically. So then I will go in the second part into the conceptualization of this new. There's a big debate whether they are neoliberal or not, neoliberal kids on the block. I will look at the changing role of political authority in the economy, and also the revival of a statist developmentalist agenda and how this is conceptualized. And then starting from there, I will talk a bit about the blind spots of this new conceptualization of these transformations. So let me start. So the first thing, so the great financial crisis as a turning point. So for East Central Europe, which, as you I think all know, that have been really very strongly shaped by a hyper-integrationist and highly neoliberal Washington consensus type of return to world markets and to capitalism. The great financial crisis has been a turning point because this growth model, or the diverse, I mean, there are diversities of neoliberalism, but neoliberalism is the overarching regime, basically, through how these countries have been integrated. And the great financial crisis has challenged this because it basically has led to a sudden reversal of stop and reversal of capital flows, and it has also made FDI, so foreign direct investment, that these countries were extremely reliant on, has made it much less or much more volatile and much less reliable. So in the graph you see on the right side there, you see the FDI inflow, and the height was really during the 2000s. And then after the financial crisis, overall, it has slowed down quite a bit. And also some countries in the region have been subjected to IMF conditionality, which is never very pleasant for no country. And this has strongly provoked resistance as well. And so there is a lot of fermentation. If you look at, I mean, I stay mostly on the governmental area. I don't go into the everyday contestation and so on, but even on government levels, there's a lot of contestation, a lot of discussion and politicization of FDI-led growth and of the dependency, so the dependency on foreign capital and the limits to growth under neoliberal conditions. So the question then is, have this contestation, have these debates really led to policy changes? And so here I try to conceptualize policy changes, because we have a lot of literature that basically argues, yes, there is continuity, or yes, there is change, but you never quite know how this is actually really defined, right? So what do they mean by change and continuity? So what I try to do here is to conceptualize the possible alternatives to neoliberalism. And I take basically two lines of division, so the horizontal one is what in political science we normally call the left-right divide. Now, left-right divide in political science is often conceptualized as state versus markets. I think that's wrong, and I don't think I have to explain this in this audience. States are very important also for imposing neoliberalism, right, or market solutions. So the state is always there. So I instead follow Norberto Bobbio, who basically argues what we really should be looking at as the substantive aim of policy interventions. So is the aim to basically reduce inequality, that is the left, or is it a tolerance for inequality? And here you can find two reasons for accepting inequality. The one is merit, that would be the liberal, right? So some people through merit basically get higher salaries, etc. And the other is the conservative one, the hierarchy in societal hierarchy. So both of them, so the right, the liberal right, and the the conservative right basically have a tolerance for inequality. So this is how one can distinguish between left and right solutions. And then the other, and that is a new axis of contestation that has emerged already earlier in Western Europe, in the US. In Eastern Europe, not so much, but it has really emerged strongly since the financial crisis, and that is basically what we could call the transnational cleavage. So the question how much international integration is really desired and how much national sovereignty. So how important is national sovereignty for countries, and that especially in countries that have been subjected to IMF conditionality or EU conditionality, of course, is a big issue. And based on this conceptual map, I can distinguish 4 ideal typical areas of responses, and I don't talk you through the left ones, because that is one of the things in Eastern Europe, of course, we do not see on governmental level, right? We do not see left-wing responses. There is an absence of left-wing responses. So what we see is either the continuity of mainstream neoliberalism, and mainstream neoliberalism is very closely connected to transnational integration. I mean, Quinn Slobodian makes this case very clearly. It's basically encasement of national economy. And we have the contestation, so the nationalist right. And the nationalist right, which is challenging sovereignty. So the kind of policies or the responses that we see, they are not a total break with neoliberalism. So you see a couple of policies that are neoliberal, like low taxation, workfare, for instance, right? But what is important is that there is a selective economic nationalism, only selective. It's not like in the 1930s. And that there is a mixture of heterodox and conservative and neoliberal policy. So this mixture, and the state really calls the shots, basically, picks the winners and the losers. So in that sense, the nationalist right has some continuity with previous neoliberal policies. And one of my arguments that I make in a broader comparison with Southern Europe is to say that one of the reasons why Orban could, for instance, do what he wanted in economic policies and Syriza or Podemos could not, really has to do with that they do not challenge the overall economic consensus too strongly, but they deviate from it on certain levels. So the result, I mean, if we go through mapping, basically, the policy responses after the great financial crisis, the first interesting thing is that most of the countries in the region stayed firmly on the mainstream neoliberal. So you have all the Baltic states, Bulgaria, and also the Czech Republic. I mean, we call it embedded neoliberal, but it's still, it doesn't challenge the neoliberal consensus. Romania, Slovenia, and Slovakia played a little bit around with alternatives, not very strongly, but from time to time. And we see only 2 countries that really firmly and stably moved into the nationalist right corner. These are Hungary and Poland with their typical, I will talk more about their specific policies later. So, so what is really surprising is this resilience of neoliberalism, despite the fact that it becomes more difficult, basically, to push it through because the global context has changed quite a bit. Now, also, this will be very brief, but clearly my research, like everybody else's research, has been disrupted by the COVID-19 crisis. And one of the questions is, of course, that COVID-19 has raised the issue of neoliberal continuity once more and very strongly, right, for several reasons. So, and basically, I mean, it is COVID-19, as McNamara and Newman argue in an article, it's a kind of big reveal. So it reveals developments that have been there before, but they come to the open all of a sudden because it's clear now that that basically you cannot ignore them anymore. One of the first or the most important one is underfinanced healthcare systems, right? So that is something, and the pictures are from actually a COVID-19 ward in Hungary. The very conservative Chamber of Medical Doctors has put these on Facebook because even they were kind of saying, under these conditions, we cannot fight COVID-19. And in Hungary, and I think it's not the only country, most of the infections in the first and second wave happened in hospitals, right? So, I mean, things like that. So it also, the massive immigration of healthcare personnel is another issue that came to the fore. The essential workers at the bottom, that East European workers were really at the bottom of these hierarchies, and they were most exposed, and they think about the meat workers in German meatworking factories, etc., and also the over-reliance on transnational supply chains. So again, you would expect a shake up of government policies and basically an attempt of trying to cope with these things. So we looked a little bit into what have been the socioeconomic responses to the COVID-19 crisis, and this is very cursory what I tell, but sorry. So what we see on the one hand, there is indeed what we could call crisis Keynesianism, at least in some countries. So the dark blue lines are basically so-called above the line spending. This is only during the first and second wave, so it's not updated data, but this shows you the most immediate responses. So it basically above the line spending is spending, direct government spending, fiscal spending, and below the lines are guarantees and loans and so on. And you can basically see that two countries stand out in terms of on the right hand side you have Western Europe, so that's and you can compare the Eastern Europe to Western Europe, and you can basically see that that Latvia and also Poland are outstanding in above the line spending, and the Czech Republic is outstanding in these below the line promises. But then for the rest of the countries and spending, basically, it is below the average of what West European countries have spent. So it is a kind of deviation, if you want. So there is a crisis Keynesianism, but it is not. It depends on countries, and it is also not outstanding. And then we looked a little bit into what do countries spend these monies or these promises for. So what we basically try to figure out, do they only try to basically keep the status quo, keep the economy running and the labor force supported, or do they really address some of the issues like the healthcare system, healthcare workers, broader societal needs? So do they upgrade their social and labor market programs? And then the upgrading can be particularistic, like in the Polish case. So the Polish response was quite extensive, as we have seen, but this mostly went into their family programs. So it didn't get to the broader population, those who are not family and who don't have children and so on. So so it's a particularistic upgrading. Then Lithuania and Slovenia both also try to address some of the vulnerabilities, especially of the healthcare sectors, and also persons who were not normally part of social benefits. I mean, most dire, Hungary, Latvia, and Romania basically spent very particularistic, mostly for their own clientele. So this is a very clientelistic kind of policy that fostered their political regime. Czech Republic, Slovakia, and Estonia spent overall more equal, more generalized, but there was no real upgrading of and especially targeting of the vulnerable sectors and groups. So let me come to the summary of this part. Has neoliberalism been abandoned? And my argument here is basically why there have been important shifts. Those authors who see the end of neoliberalism overlook continuity, and it comes in two forms. In most East Central European countries, policy continuity seems stronger than change, despite the challenges of the two crises. And even in those cases where major changes have taken place, neoliberal policies are an important part of a new heterodox policy toolbox. So there's no wholesale abandonment. And then, of course, I mean, we cannot, or things might now with the third crisis stemming from the repercussions of the Russian war in Ukraine, a lot of this might be challenged for very different reasons. This winter will show us, and we can talk about basically the perspectives, because Eastern Europe as a region is much harder touched by any of the economic repercussions than Western Europe. And this is often overlooked because, of course, many East European countries are also very strong politically, so seem, at least until now, ready to pay the cost for it. So I don't know how this will play out, but until this February, this is how it looked, I would say, more or less. No, but still, I talked about Hungary and Poland at the moment only as giving this conservative nationalist response. Now there is more than conservatism and nationalism. So there is a turn, a political and economic turn towards a much more authoritarian form of capitalism on the one hand, but there might also be an attempt of developmentalism on the other hand. So how does the literature conceptualize what happens in Poland and Hungary right now? I distinguish here two dimensions, which I think are important if we go through the literature. The one is it political actors who control the transformation, or is it basically a functionalist response to ongoing transformations? And the second question is, does the transformation that we see in Hungary and Poland serve developmental purposes, or is it basically a kind of self-serving, elite self-serving purpose? And I think we can overall distinguish four different conceptualizations of the changes. So the one is authoritarian neoliberalism, which basically says that we have a continuity, but a more authoritarian of the previous policies. The authoritarian capitalism, which basically says it's what is really changing is the elite uses the economy for serving its own purposes. None of this is developmental. Then we have an argument, the revolt of domestic elites. So this is an argument made by Marek Naczyk, where he says that basically domestic elites are not happy with their transnationalized capitalism anymore. And we have also the idea of the new authoritarian developmentalism, where basically these authors look at how the state or state actors foster a more developmentalist kind of agenda. And I will go through these a little bit more in detail. And as I said, one of the remarkable things is that it is really, there is a whole cottage industry coming mostly out of Hungary. And it's younger Hungarian scholars, transnational, they are based in Oxford, Milan, etc., but that really try to understand what is going on. Interestingly, there is very little Polish conceptualization. So apart from Marek Naczyk, and that is something I have no answer why this is the case, but clearly there is this is happening. So so let me go through the first line. So basically the question, the changing nature of political authority and the relative weight of neoliberalism. So how much continuity do we still have? How much change is there, and who is in the driving seat, right? So here the polar opposite ideas are that of authoritarian neoliberalism, which is basically the idea, and this is an old idea in British academia, therefore I think many of you know about this, that neoliberalism is constitutionalized increasingly in non-majoritarian institutions, so it is not undergoing any longer any democratic control. And these authors, so Bruff is one who started this after the great financial crisis, basically asked, so there is an even increasing authoritarianism if you look at the EU, the fiscal pact, or if you look at debt breaks and things like that. And it is really so constitutionalized that it becomes authoritarian. It cannot be challenged anymore. And so for him, the major transformation, or for those authors who work with this concept for East Central Europe, they say that the major transformation is a deepening of neoliberalism. It's the constitutionalization of austerity, and it is at the same time combined with methods of cooptation, coercion, and stoking xenophobic sentiment. So they make an argument also about how do you gain hegemony under authoritarian neoliberalism? How do you make people who should not like this like it? And xenophobia is one of the ways how to do it. Cooptation, parts of the national bourgeoisie into it, etc., and coercion, workfare programs. So the authoritarian neoliberalism debate is basically has its theoretical roots in Marxism. So neoliberalism is a class project. It's a deepening of that class project. And they argue, these authors argue, one of the reasons why there is really, so how should I say, why even workers kind of support this program is exactly that they are so disenchanted with the previous policies and they buy into this hegemonic aspect of authoritarian neoliberalism. But it's never very well explained how do you gain hegemony. But that's the authoritarian neoliberalism. So the authoritarian capitalism people, they argue the opposite. They basically, the main argument is that it is what is new for Eastern Europe, or for the two cases, is that the elites basically use the economy for their private purpose. So they see at the core of the transformation the reconfiguration of two boundaries between the public and the private, which violates the rule of law, so the previous political system. This is the violation of the principle of self-limitation of the state. So the state, there should be a border between the state and the market. And that is violated by transgressing that border through nationalization, through all kinds of intervention in the economy. And then also the violation of state autonomy via elites colonialization of the state. So the elites basically appropriate the state and the state apparatus to foster their own interest. So the nature of the transformation is really the conscious use of status tools by the elites to expand their spheres of interest and use it to their prizes with exclusive gains. They do not explain at all how this become a more generally supported argument. They really say it's an authoritarian capitalism. It's not hegemonic. And yeah, the theoretical roots here are more the national business systems, but also literature on the developmental state. And then we have, so this is basically the conceptualizations of the changing nature between authority, political authority, and the state. The second is this lower debate, is there a return to development or a more developmentalist agenda? Because one of the contestations clearly is that neoliberalism, and this is stronger in Poland than in Hungary, has led to a dead end in terms of economic development. It has basically led to a middle income trap. So I just quote here a couple of authors. So Apple and Orenstein in a book from 2018 argue that neoliberalism declined as a driving force of economic change, and other agendas could rise. And so there is a neo-developmental policy agenda. Then Marek Naczyk, he makes this argument more strongly, and he also traces it really empirically on the Polish case, showing that there is really developmentalism has emerged. So the ideology and also the practice that the state pursues infrastructure projects and industrial policies in order to help domestic firms to upgrade their technology capacity, to enter new lines of businesses. And this has re-emerged as a legitimate agenda in Eastern Europe. It was absent for a very long time. This literature also, I mean, there's more, there's the work by Katharina Blum and others, Aaron Buzogan and so on, Mihail Varga, the whole, so these authors are sympathetic with the transformations. So in contrast to what you see, I mean, the authoritarian neoliberalism and authoritarian capitalism, people mostly refer to Hungary. They don't like what's happening. These authors are quite normative. They kind of think there's a point, developmentalism has a role to play. And you see also, I mean, this is a fantastic, I cannot even read it entirely, the transition report, which used to be an extremely neoliberal kind of report, always evaluating the progress of countries. And you see here this image of the socialist nanny state returning, right? And taking over everybody and everything. So there is an overwhelming sense that the nanny state is there to protect, but also to develop, to help countries to develop. So let me summarize this part. So what I try to convey is that the ideas of authoritarianism, statism, and developmentalism as the new features of some of East Central Europeans post, or I should say Hungary's and Poland's post financial crisis capitalisms are clearly identified and stressed. These new features are often analyzed by going back to older paradigms in political economy. So Marxism very prominent, but also developmental theories. And they are also steeped in a more critical and part of them. So the authoritarian capitalism not, but the others are steeped in a more critical and progressive worldview than the one that dominated comparative capitalism prior to the great financial crisis. But there is, so with this comes also something that I find really striking when I read through this literature. It's basically the word they portray. So those, the word of contestation, of disappointment, and of what the changes are is basically one, it's a word of industrial capitalism, and the betrayed heroes are the blue-collar industrial workers, and or the industries, the domestic industries. And so this clearly has blind spots, right? Because the major transformations, clearly the industrial, the reshaping of the industries has been a major issue, but major transformations concern other sectors, and that is not in the focus of this literature. So this is how where I want to go with the third and final part of my talk. So emerging or engaging with blind spots. I mean, there is a lot of blind spots in that literature that cannot be differently, but I picked this one, which I think is so obvious and so important. And I think especially through the COVID crisis, it has come so much to the fore, and yet this literature at least doesn't really talk about this very much, and that is one of gender. So if let me start with the 3 quotations. So I mean, when I was reading through some of the more feminist political economy that the great financial crisis and recent transformations has produced, I mean, there's striking stuff going on. So that even, this is what Valen says, even the more critical analysis, like the authoritarian neoliberalism people, they add gender to up, right? So basically, they kind of subsume that women are somehow, they are always the victims, and they basically, you know, it comes as an afterthought. Then there's race and gender and class, but what really matters is class, right? So there is not really an attempt to look at the unequal and different ways how these issues intersect. And women are also seen as as victims rather than as agents in this whole story. Then Gal Plickman have written a book about socialist transformation, where they explicitly take a feminist point of view to look at the transformations. And they say that authoritarianism is really basically being unearthed or dimensions of authoritarianism if you look at it from a feminist perspective. And then this book by Hosic and True, which basically shows that there is a strong connection between the macroeconomy, the financial sphere, and the household, the family, which any political economy literature that focuses on industry and just state finance or also public debt doesn't really make the connection between the micro and the macro. So I think what we can do is basically work through these frameworks of authoritarian neoliberalism and authoritarian capitalism. And if we apply a gendered lens to basically expand them and this way get to a conceptualization of broader changes that I think are really characteristic and written in the current transformations. So let me start with the first one. So authoritarian neoliberalism through the lens of public sector restructuring. So we read a lot about of austerity, but never how this targets the public sector. Now, it is well known that the public sector is mostly where women work. So it is a highly feminized work sector. So how does this affect basically the transformation, the political and economic transformation? This is just an illustration of the healthcare sector. So it is about the finance and the migration in the healthcare sector. So basically countries that are in red, they have underfinanced healthcare sector and a high immigration of healthcare workers, mostly women. And the countries in blue, the bluer you are, the better finances your healthcare system and the better and the more immigrants you take in your healthcare system. This is a well-known story. The West plugs its holes in the healthcare system or other care systems, basically through importing doctors and nurses from the East. Now, what does this mean? We know what are the repercussions for health in Eastern Europe, right? But what does it mean politically? If your educated workforce basically leaves behind more uneducated workforce. And if women leave in drones and leave behind, or maybe men also leave in drones, right? So what is this, I mean, to speak with Hirschman, this idea of exit voice. So you have exit rather than voice. What does it mean for the polity and what does it mean for the economy? So just this is something I think we should really better understand and think and research in order to understand partly the if you want hegemony or whatever, or the nature of the authoritarian rule. But there is something else to it. So if you take the exit voice, so not all educated people actually leave. They are also conservative educated women in the public sector that stay. And this is here, I mean, it's a little bit a lengthy quotation. I'm sorry for that. This is research from done by Bela Grešković on the so-called civic circles. So the civic circles are basically a civil society organization that has been built by Viktor Orban. So you have basically Viktor Orban moving into civil society, and the civic circles moving into and bringing together conservative civil society that has been there. And these are typically educated people in the public sector. There are a lot of women, and the women are conservative women, and they have so the quotation I give you is basically, you see that there is a strong moral contention of neoliberalism or neoliberal education reform, which could be a left wing, but it's a very conservative way of criticizing it. And this is one of the civic circles that basically discuss this. So you see that women are not just victims, but they are also part of the power block that underlines the Orban regime, right? So this is, and he picks up some of these conservative disenchantment and builds or helps build it into a kind of more cohesive ideology, which then basically underpins his rule as well. So if I take what I just said to enlarge now, so this is basically what the authoritarian neoliberalism way of thinking does not really conceptualize. If I now take what I was just saying to the authoritarian capitalism framework, then I think it offers a quite nice way of thinking about the shifts and transformations by basically indicating these boundary struggles between the rule of law and the economy, so the private and the public. But they only look at states and markets. So in how far the state basically interferes in markets, in how far it violates property rights, etc., etc. But I take this. So we can also say that there is another boundary shifting going on that is between state and civil society. So basically where the state, and we have a similar phenomenon also in Poland, where the state, a conservative state, moves into civil society, creates a civil society organization or merges with civil society. And this is where moral leadership and hegemony has been being forged. So it is much more than just adding xenophobia or stoking xenophobic resentment. It is really about building moral leadership through the penetration of state and civil society. And I think that is a very important part of the changing nature of capitalism, because the economy has always a moral story. Even liberalism has a moral story, right? So it's not independent. And then we have another sphere that is basically being overlooked by both authoritarian capitalism and authoritarian neoliberalism, and that is what feminist scholarship calls the sphere of social reproduction. So basically all the work that is being done in order to even produce workers, educated persons, etc. And so these boundary struggles between state and these three spheres, if you want, and the kind of moral leadership that is being forged through the merger of state and civil society also influences the sphere of social reproduction. And I come to my end. I just give you two examples of this from the Hungarian case. The one is what Eva Fodor calls the care-fair regime. So this is basically how Orban has the Orban regime has reshaped the sphere of, or the division, let's put it this way, the division of labor between family and the production, and within this division of labor between women and men. And basically the care-fair regime, so Hungary has retrenched entirely its welfare state, but has expanded strongly its family policies. And the family policies are based on the premise that women have to do both waged work and care work. So it's not women are sent back home. This is more the Polish story. In Hungary, women have to do both. They don't get equal rights in the paid work. They have a president. Hungary has a president who basically said women should work, but not expect to be paid equally, right? Because they're women. But they also have to do the care work. And they're basically their right to social citizenship is based on the fact whether they do care work or not. So if you don't have children, if you don't have a family, your rights are less than if you have those. Your social rights are less than if you have those. And also the sphere of care work has expanded. So elderly care is now being part of basically what families have to do, etc., etc. So the care is entirely put on women's shoulders, basically, and their social rights depend very strongly on this. And there's also an ongoing churchification of some of the sphere of social reproduction. So the church has been taken over a lot of schools and other public institutions. So you get here also the penetration of this particular conservative ideology in the sphere of social reproduction. And this is so this care-fair regime is one of the main political, ideological, and economic backbones of Hungary's anti-liberal regime, right? So it's a very strong strong element of it. And then there is another example. So we talk a lot about financialization of housing that has taken place before the great financial crisis, and Orbanomics, or economic policies, were basically also often hailed by left-wing people, because they led to definancialization. So the state basically took over housing again as a task. And we see also the proliferation of these policies in partly Poland and also Romania. So it has made, but then what is often overlooked is actually how much of this is also again gendered. So who has now access to housing? It's families. Families with 1, 2, 3, or 4 children get credits. Non-families don't get credits, right? So there is a whole family policy program, and access to housing is again mediated through basically a fertility agenda which is fostered by the state. So these were just examples basically of how the transformations of capitalism are much broader than what at least I in my field normally read, and how if we take this more systematically into account, or we need to take it more systematically into account in order to get an understanding of basically the transformation beyond capitalism of societies that are taking place, not only in Hungary and Poland, but there it is most obvious. So with this, I conclude. I think I have made 3 points. The first one is, despite 2 major crises, neoliberalism has been surprisingly resilient in the region. Now, in those where, while we have new developments like authoritarianism, statism, and developmentalism, they have been, they are partly new features. The recent literature's focus on the word of industrial capitalism makes it blind to more encompassing transformations. And I think that comparative capitalism research needs to engage systematically with the insights of feminist scholarship and feminist political economy. And this is only one of the blind spots, but I think a very important one that it needs to do in order to get a better understanding. And with this, I conclude. Thank you very much.
No. Yes. Not to take away your microphone, I can hold this one. I would immediately open space if there are questions, because we don't have so much time. Okay, I already see the hand. Hans, please.
Thank you, Dorothy. This financial crisis affected not only Eastern Europe, but all other countries, Germany, Austria, for example. And we also could observe authoritarian measures in Germany, for example, measures to rescue banks was in Austria. And but these measures stopped after some time. So we went back to the normal regime. So for me, the question is, what are reasons for this resilience of these authoritarian measures in Hungary and in Poland? In particular, is it the economy, so the level of GDP per capita, for example, which is higher in Germany, Austria than in Hungary, Poland? Or is it the history, the fact that these countries, they had to live many years in the backyard of the Soviet Union? So what could be possible reasons for this, what we observe here in this context?
Should I? Okay. Okay, so fundamentally, if you want, my sense is, and it's a very strong sense, because I mean, I've been living quite some time in Hungary and developed it, and I've been following Poland quite closely. I do think there is a real attempt of creating an alternative economic and political order in both countries. So it's not just corruption. It's not just economies that, you know, have been, that have been poorer capitalism, or institutions that are not functioning as well as in the West. But it is basically a conservative, I mean, I would say radical right conservative agenda that has its roots probably intellectually in the interwar period and is being revived in Poland, certainly since the 1980s. In Hungary, basically you see traces of it since the 1990s, but then Orban has really adopted it, as I said, with this civil society. So he has really moved into this, and this is now being really developed into a coherent alternative to liberal economy and the liberal economy and the liberal polity. And I don't think that this is uniquely Eastern Europe, because if my sense or my hunch is, if we get some of these radical right-wing conservative forces in government in other countries, some of the measures will be very similar. Now the two countries, then there is a difference, and that is basically in Hungary, the whole thing has merged also into a much more corrupt economy. That reason is, I think, different types of leadership, and that might make it more vulnerable than Poland, where corruption has not been very strong, and this means that this kind of alternative is more livable in the long run. So it's, if you want, the short answer is really a struggle over hegemony towards an illiberal or anti-liberal economic and political system.
Thank you for an interesting talk. I'm from Sweden, where we had national elections on Sunday. And the results from yesterday is that we are moving downwards to the corner of Poland and Hungary. And I was just wondering, yesterday Henry speculated about what the future holds. Could you say something about, based on your experience, where is Europe moving on your matrix? Is there any chance for the left?
Question coming up. Do you want to take both?
I can take both, yes.
Yeah. Please.
Okay. I'm very happy that in such a small conference we had so far very excellent keynotes, and you almost it was a really comprehensive and structured presentation, and you almost answered my question, but I still left three small one. Eastern Europe went through 3+1 different crises. So this Great Recession, COVID crisis, energy crisis in combination, the war. So do you think that the impact of these kind of external shocks considered or revealed the systemic vulnerability of the transition model? So this cannot be considered really an external effect, which is partially different because it's a kind of semi-periphery, but it's revealed the kind of failure or the reconsideration as a systemic vulnerability. The second is this kind of, if it's a systemic vulnerability, is it more rooted on this FDI dependent nature of the neoliberal transition, or the weak institutional frameworks and related politics is more responsible for it? And my last related comment, do you think that CE discontent are in considering this context is different what we have in the West? And one more short, sorry about it, but you and also Henry mentioned the potential of development state model. Do you think, because your excellent classification included or referred for this, do you think has a good potential for the clear-cut development development state model, or just the crony capitalism what we have for the future? Thank you.
Thanks so much. I know that there is one more question waiting, but perhaps we now give you the space to respond. I have to say, I also have so many questions and some of them were raised. I mean, you had this very skeptical outlook at the optimism of people towards this developmentalist moves of Polish and Hungarian governments. So now I can also hear some more on this. We hear you, Doro, and then we can collect more questions.
Okay, thank you. I mean, all these questions would warrant another talk, to be honest. And I'm not sure I can even think through them, but these are excellent questions. Let me start maybe by your question about the overall future, where Europe is moving, and within it the role of the left. So I personally see Europe, and I don't see a fundamental difference between East and West, although it comes from different directions. But the fundamental struggle at the moment is indeed between a radical right that is also emboldened by the many crises and uses the many crises, of course, a weakening center right, with that basically like what happened in Sweden, but that always happens, right? That basically they think if they talk the same talk as the radicals, then they will benefit from it, and who benefits is the original. It's always like this. So, I mean, I could have told the moderates not to do that, but they wouldn't listen to me. In any case, so we have that, and I'm really convinced they have a project. They have an alternative vision. And the problem of the left is it does not have currently an ideology. It does not have a vision. And it's very difficult. And this is, I mean, we could talk about this for many, I mean, I think this is one of the most important issues, but the left is divided like it is always divided. You have the issues between material and identity issues, which are tearing the left apart. And you don't have a reinvention of the left. I mean, the center left has basically, of course, it's in the same place as the center right, because it is wedded to the old neoliberal regime, right? So it is very, and in this, therefore, I don't necessarily, it is a struggle, and you have enough liberal forces, I think, in both parts of the continent to say that this struggle is not won. But I see basically the extreme or far radical right pushing the agenda. And the struggle is exactly about, it's not about industry. I think here actually everybody agrees, some reindustrializations, the struggle is over the internationalization / national autonomy and the kind of hierarchical gendered, racialized order that you implement at home. And that is where the action is, and that is also an economic question. The three crises. So again, I think, so your first question, I think at the end of the day, what we are seeing is a historical shift, as we have seen at the beginning of the turn of the 19th to the 20th century, the end of the first globalization. So I think what we are really seeing now is the end or the transformation, the change of the second globalization, which is global. It's not only East European. The specific East European lens is that of FDI dependency because it was so strong, right? This is the entry point, how it started. But this discontent or the dysfunctionality, I mean, you know, I was just yesterday talking to Lela about, I lived currently in Austria, and I come to Germany with this incredibly crumbling infrastructure. And I'm like, it's amazing, right? So there is an understanding in Germany as well that the neoliberal, I mean, there is an understanding that this neoliberal global export-oriented model is basically has backfired. And of course, we have this geopolitical stuff going on now, which is huge, and so on and so on. So we basically come to a fundamental transformation of the neoliberal global regime, which is shaped, and that's unfortunately the story, it's shaped by war, and probably it is always, and is shaped by geopolitical rivalries, and it is shaped by a very, at least in the short run, a very conservative outlook. And then it has regional ways of what are the specific vulnerabilities. And Eastern Europe is more vulnerable. And as I said, the FDI story looms large. The one thing, because I still, and then I give the floor back to the audience, let me shortly address whether I see a possibility for developmentalism. In some sense, probably yes. And it could also, I mean, you know, it was not foregone that the Hungarian way turned so corrupt as it does. And I think when you look at the Polish policies, indeed, there is a relatively strong developmental impulse. And in some sense, the current conjuncture leads itself to it, because the disruption of global supply chains, we have the scene when with the vaccines, the production of masks, all that stuff. So the idea that you can rely on China or the rest of the world for everything, that belief is over. And this will inevitably lead to some redevelopmentalism or some renewed developmental agenda. I think my point is more to, and I think it is possible, my point is more to say that it's not the same anymore than, it's not a reindustrialization like in the 1930s when this developmental agenda started, right? We are at the end of industrial capitalism. We are dealing with a very different animal. And that animal has also many non-industrial parts. So we have to really think through what is developmentalism. And there, again, I think, and for that, I see much less of a chance. If you think about, you know, a caring economy or something like that, right? Which would be an outlook for a new developmentalism, but that I don't see. So I am afraid social conservatism goes hand in hand with the revival of traditional industrial policies, maybe. And yes, that's limited developmentalism, but that's not necessarily the one we want to see politically.
We have one more question waiting by James, right?
Thank you for this really wonderful. Oh, okay.
Yeah, please.
Thank you for this really wonderful talk. I just wondered if you could just reflect on two approaches. One is thinking more about kind of cause, semi-periphery, periphery, and whether this kind of thinking is helpful for what you're doing. I mean, you kind of touched on it, but the ways in which the kind of neoliberal global model, which appeals so much from the 80s, begins to kind of collapse as a catching up ideology, and you know how that, you know, how sort of expert culture start to shift on that, and how that shifts politics as well, and where you place Central Eastern Europe within that, and whether it's used. I mean, given your wonderful work on peripheries, right? I'd be really interested to hear much more on this. And also thinking more and picking up what you just said about thinking about the region in a global context. Because obviously, you know, these shifts are really global, and we see all sorts of forms of liberalism, critiques of liberal globalization, national developmentalism, all sorts of things all over the place. And of course, we also know that some of these leaders also are looking to these places, and we can think of Orban and his fascination with Singapore, for example, to kind of link up to what we were talking about yesterday. So could you say something more about how we think about this in a global context? Thank you.
Again, two really important and very broad questions. So the one thing with this core semi-periphery, so if you want, if I take Wallerstein or something, I would say Eastern Europe is in the, actually, Bela Grešković made this, and I think it makes a lot of sense. It's in the semi-core, the region I look at, right? Because it is so much formed still by really the core, but it doesn't have this kind of, you know, if you look at the production profile, if you look at also the politics, it doesn't have this kind of bad terms of trade, the dependence and the being locked in a very low road kind of developmental model, but is, I mean, one of the issues I think, which was quite unexpected after the transition, or after 89, is that how some of these countries at least became manufacturing miracles of high quality goods. Now, of course, in a dependent way, right? So it is not the core in the sense that R&D is still in the West, and in more than elsewhere, profits are still basically shifted to the West, etc. And that is the revolt, the specific revolt, especially in Poland. I think the Hungarian one is also framed in this way because it's the national bourgeoisie. So here you have the dependent nature, even if you call it semi-core, but the dependent nature of capitalism again, because the domestic bourgeoisie, basically, they felt they just, I mean, all the subsidies, everything goes to the transnational firms. And some of the regulations, even labor regulations, are better for the transnational firms because they can afford, whereas the domestic, here you also have a very strong dualization of sectors, but you don't have so much in Poland. So that's one of the differences. So in that sense, yes, it's a semi-core, it's not the core, and the specific discontent is has to do with this very specific ways of being integrated into mostly the European economy. But again, this is the countries I look at. So if you go further out, of course, the global story is really tricky because I mean, to be honest, I find it very hard at the moment to really locate the nature of the tectonic shifts that we are seeing and where the region basically moves in this. Because one of the questions that I can just not answer, and I think there are people much more knowledgeable than, what is China? Is China really the new basically hegemon that will take over the US? I don't think so. Is the US again basically now, so you see, global is for me always basically underpinned by a hegemonic order on the global level, right? So is it the US basically reinventing itself once again, like it did already in the 1980s, and basically, you know, becoming again in a different form hegemonic, or still do we move basically to a disarticulation of different parts of the economy? And I mean, I know these debates have been around forever. I just don't know how to think or how to decide them. And so how serious is basically the engagement of the region with some of these more authoritarian models? Here I would say especially Hungary. And if we go to the Western Balkans, of course, some other countries, Poland, I think not so much. There is some fascination. There is the idea that Singapore has a good rule of law record, right? So, I mean, Hungary is not really following this. And there is, of course, also the hope that if we diversify, nobody can basically dominate us. This backfires again, because it's a small country, and as a small country, it doesn't work, right? So, but whether this is a way, I don't think, I do think that in this unclear the relationship, it's still at the end of the day the European, wherever Europe moves, but European links that will prove the strongest. But of course they are being disrupted by basically other actors trying to disunite them, something like that. Okay.
I think we should close this
I think so. I think we should ask the people that have questions to come around for coffee time. But thank you so much again. We, in the end, ventured into really these big topics, and I look forward to discussing this.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Colleagues, can I just remind you that you need to collect a ticket for your lunch? You'll be given 2 tickets, one for today, one for tomorrow. Don't lose them because you won't get your lunch without them.